In 2025, the South China Sea became the arena for a confrontation between Chinese and American navies. In mere minutes, the world could have plunged into the abyss of World War III. What started it all? And how was catastrophe averted as a result of a conflict we didn't even know about back then? There is information that this episode took place on June 14th, when around 9 o'clock in the morning local time, the USS Princeton was conducting another patrol to ensure freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. It was a routine, scheduled patrol, but its radar picked up something that stood out from the usual picture. A Chinese Type 052D destroyer, which had previously been patrolling at a distance of 200 kilometers, suddenly accelerated from 18 to 30 knots in less than 90 seconds. The Americans were unaware that the captain of the Zhengchun had just received an order from Beijing: intercept the Americans and force them to flinch first and retreat from these waters. It seems someone in the Middle Kingdom decided to test the resolve of the US Navy. A big mistake. The Nimitz carrier strike group was 180 nautical miles from the nearest Chinese territory, still in international waters, safeguarding trade routes with an annual turnover of $3.4 trillion. But if necessary, it could very quickly come to the aid of the USS Princeton. Soon, target classification was complete. Radar operators positively identified the Chinese Navy's Type 052D destroyer with a threat assessment ranging from moderate to high. Inside Princeton's Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer monitored the movement of the Chinese destroyer, ready in extreme necessity to use anti-ship missiles, waiting for the signal in their launch cells. And if the presumed enemy managed to shoot them down, Princeton's SM-6 missiles with a range of about 130 nautical miles would certainly reach the target. The world's most advanced naval sensor on the American ship provided clear and precise information. At the Chinese destroyer's current speed, it would reach weapons engagement range in exactly 17 minutes. The Americans waited a few more minutes, but the Chinese ship did not alter its course, and when no more than 14 minutes remained until it entered US weapons launch range, a recommendation was given to go to general quarters. At stake were not only the lives of the crews. The entire global world trade was in question. The South China Sea was teeming with cargo ships, at least 45 within a 50 nautical mile radius. All of them depended on the presence of the US Navy as a guarantor of safe passage. Massive container ships carried cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars, semiconductors, oil, foodstuffs, and much more. The trade routes were safe, not in and of themselves, but precisely because of the presence of the US Navy and the multitude of international treaties that made this presence legitimate. The Chinese adventure, if successful, would have dealt a devastating blow, including to China itself, as a state that relies on international trade more than any other. Princeton's Joint Operational Capability System automatically transmitted threat data to all ships in the strike group. The Nimitz itself, 104,600 tons of floating American diplomacy, carrying 90 of the world's most modern aircraft, adjusted its flight operations with switch-watch precision. Destroyers Chung Hoon and Kidd shifted positions to take up stations around the carrier, turning any Chinese attack into a one-way trip to the bottom. The tactical picture shifted from alarming to dangerous. An E-2D Hawkeye long-range radar detection aircraft patrolling at 25,000 feet and providing visibility over a 400-mile radius detected numerous aircraft taking off from the Chinese carrier Shandong. It was equipped with the so-called ski jump for fighter takeoffs, a system Chinese engineers were justifiably proud of. These were multifunctional J-15 fighters climbing in altitude and heading south. The Chinese likely realized their mistake by then. US air traffic controllers noted that the J-15s were climbing unusually slowly for their specs. Probably, the ski jump imposed restrictions on fuel load, and the Chinese fighters were only partially fueled. Clearly, this put them in a vulnerable position. Nevertheless, a minute later, it became clear that the Chinese intentions were serious. US sonar operators detected a possible underwater contact 80 nautical miles away. The acoustic signature matched a Type 039 diesel-electric submarine. In other words, submarine, surface, and air components had been activated, and this already looked like a full-scale attack. Experience told him that, despite the seriousness of the situation, this was most likely bluff. The Type 039 submarine is very noisy, making it an excellent target for more modern American torpedoes. Beijing's surface ships are formidable, but their equipment is likely something from the 1990s. Carrier-based aircraft couldn't carry a full combat load, and the fighters themselves clearly didn't have enough fuel for a serious air battle. Perhaps if such a fake attack had been aimed at the Philippine or Indonesian fleet, Beijing would have celebrated another victory. But this time, they underestimated the opponent, not only in terms of real experience and skills, but the US Navy is at an entirely different level technologically. On the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, FA-18E Super Hornets from VFA-14 Squadron top hatters launched from the catapults at 45-second intervals. Soon, the first squadron of Super Hornets climbed to 15,000 feet. Their AN/APG-79 AESA radars had already detected the approaching J-15s at maximum range. If a dogfight happened, it wouldn't be a fight, it would be a massacre. The difference in system parameters and pilot experience is too great. Hundreds of transmit-receive modules in the APG-79 of American aircraft could track dozens of targets simultaneously, while the J-15's mechanically scanned radar itself broadcasts its aircraft's position to the presumed enemy, making it an easy target. The J-15 struggled to gain altitude, a painful reminder of the Shandong ski jump limitations. Without catapults, they took off with reduced fuel and weapons. They climbed quickly to gain energy advantage, but burned fuel faster as a result. Meanwhile, American fighters launching with full combat loads had fuel reserves and carried all aspect munitions. However, that's far from the main thing. Every F-18 was linked via Link 16, exchanging sensor data in real time. When one plane saw something, everyone saw it. Chinese pilots, meanwhile, relied on voice commands and individual sensors, increasing response time and effectively depriving them of teamwork capabilities. Then, electronic warfare fighter bombers EA-18G Growlers entered the fray without firing a single shot. For electronic warfare, they carried ALQ-99 and ALQ-249 NGJ pods capable of destroying enemy electronics. Soon, Chinese communications began to break down. Radar screens multiplied with phantom contacts. Signals glitched, and relying on equipment data became impossible. Radar logs constantly dropped and reacquired, and the number of American fighters kept changing. Meanwhile, the Americans employed a tactical formation called the Wall. This defensive setup, ideal for the situation, involved 3 flights operating at different altitudes: high at 35,000 feet, middle at 25,000, and low at 15,000. This mutual support not only allowed more effective interaction, but also stripped the potential enemy of any chances for coordinated retreat, let alone maneuvering. On the other hand, the Chinese aircraft seemed to have no clear formation at all. But to be fair, this was a consequence of technical limitations, not low pilot skill. Quite the opposite. It forced them to maintain visual contact for coordination, making them expend full effort even before the fight began. Meanwhile, Princeton's defense systems tracked every threat using the spy radar. Soon, Junchun was at striking distance. Its Type 346A phased array radar locked onto the USS Nimitz with fire control accuracy. What does that mean? Imagine someone pulling out a pistol and aiming the barrel at you. The American response was restrained, not only to avoid escalation, but mainly for their own efficiency. Princeton's fire control radars remained in standby mode simply because the US ship's advantage was too overwhelming. The Chinese destroyer was under threat from multiple systems, from multiple directions, with zero chance of survival if things escalated. The Chinese attack wouldn't even start before missiles were already en route to the destroyer, leaving unrecognizable wreckage. Fortunately for all of us, it didn't happen. The Chinese, figuratively speaking, kept the American ship in their sights for about half a minute, enough to make a statement, but not enough to provoke US self-defense measures. It was a bluff, but a very unwise one. Princeton's crew documented timestamps, signal characteristics, and azimuth data. In case of real war, this info would be useful, so you could say the Chinese exposed themselves with their own audacity. However, even though the Chinese ship seized illumination, this was far from the end of the story. One of the J-15s broke from the others and dove toward an F-18 in what fighter pilots call a thump, an aggressive close pass meant to intimidate. The American pilot, trained at Top Gun, where such maneuvers are eaten for breakfast, simply rolled and took a 6 o'clock position behind the Chinese fighter. In 3 seconds, the American had a perfect firing position. You've seen fencing scenes in movies where an experienced teacher halts a cocky student's attack with the blade at his throat. There was something like that. The Chinese pilot was made to understand he was just a toy in the hands of a more experienced opponent. In a flash, an AIM-9X Sidewinder missile would have streaked right into the J-15's exhaust. Of course, the Chinese pilot backed off. The Americans demonstrated an undisputable advantage on the water and in the air. One level of confrontation remained. The Chinese submarine made its move, the Type 039 diesel-electric sub, using the thermocline depth to hide its approach, inexorably closed in. But at 9:51, it made a critical error by raising its snorkel to recharge batteries, giving itself away. The sonar operator reported to command that the possible enemy was at 15,000 yards. Now the Chinese sub was in the crosshairs. The Americans had its acoustic profile, precisely determined its position, and tracked any activity. In case of real aggression, an American ASROC missile would have struck that target. The tactical situation turned out to be completely losing for the Chinese. Beijing's strike group found itself in a sort of box, carrier to the northwest, destroyer to the west, and submarine to the southwest. The situation hung by a thread, like gunslingers in the Wild West who had already drawn and aimed loaded revolvers at each other, but hadn't fired yet. If the Chinese had opened fire, none of them would have survived the first 5 minutes. But a clash of such forces would have led to chaos, and possibly a full-scale war that would destroy the world economy if the two richest advanced powers locked horns in confrontation. For the next few hours, the Chinese ceased active actions. But would they really retreat or try to push the US Navy out of these waters? Only a decisive demonstration of force could convince them not to make this mistake. A few hours later, in the heat of the day, the USS Nimitz launched everything that could fly. 48 aircraft soared from its deck from one carrier. These were Super Hornets loaded with combat weapons, as well as EA-18G Growlers carrying electronic warfare suites that could black out an entire city. E-2D Hawkeyes commanded. The Growler's non-lethal weapons activated, and if any Beijing Navy scanning systems were still operational, after that, Chinese screens showed only bright spots of hundreds of false contacts instead of clear data and numbers. Then, a Virginia-class nuclear strike submarine appeared, which had been shadowing the Chinese formation for 8 days. And all that time, it remained undetected, thanks to maneuvering skill, advanced tech, and iron discipline of the crew. There is even information, which falls into the realm of legends, given the scale and uniqueness of the events, that at 1547, it surfaced 6 nautical miles from the Shandong. That's close enough for Chinese observers to see its black hull with the naked eye. For them, the sudden appearance of such a powerful potential adversary was a shock. The submarine had slipped right under their noses and seemingly teleported so close, and now it deliberately revealed its position in ironclad confidence of its superiority. The psychological impact of such a move is hard to overestimate. About a minute and a half later, the Virginia submerged again. Meanwhile, in the air, American fighters demonstrated their advantages. This wasn't a fight yet, just a quiet simulation. Not a single shot, just maneuvers. But that proved more than enough. Every simulated engagement ended the same way. American fighters seized the initiative and dictated terms to the presumed enemy. One by one, Chinese aircraft turned around and returned to base with critically low fuel. Finally, closer to evening, the Shandong carrier strike group began to withdraw. Official channels reported that the Chinese Navy was conducting exercises in the region. However, the Americans knew what kind of exercises these were, a rehearsal of real combat that showed Beijing it's still far from being able to compete with Washington, at least for now. The entire described episode is the author's interpretation of observed Chinese Navy activity in early June 2025. The plot does not claim full accuracy, being dedicated to comparing the potentials of two rival states. All details of a possible confrontation between Chinese and American navies remain far from the public. The analysis is indirect, based on data available in open sources and fact comparisons. However, Beijing's desire to seize control of the South China Sea is obvious, as is the fact that Washington is still reliably holding its positions there.